Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of about 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is Mark R. Anderson. Mark Anderson's a Colorado history and MA in military studies from the American Military University. Spent 22 years in the Air Force, active duty in Iraq and coalition operations in Afghanistan. And he's turned to history. And the book we'll be talking about is The Battle for the 14th Colony, America's War of Liberation in Canada, 1774 to 1776. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk to you, Bob.
And it's a great story about this 2 years in which the United States or the American colonies were engaged trying to bring Canada into the fold as the 14th colony. And I mean, you really approach I don't want to tell you how you approach the book, but you do approach it in a way looking at well, why don't you tell us, who were the Canadians? Who were the people on north of the border that were trying to be brought into the fold, because it only recently had become a British territory?
Yeah. So first off, it's not the Canada we think of today, coast to coast. It's really the equivalent of the modern province of Quebec and has a lot of the same structural features there. It was about 110,000 people-ish, French origins as from the colony of New France, Catholic, and they had been conquered by Britain in the 7 Years' War and officially became part of the British Empire in 1763. Starting with the war and continuing on once Canada was brought into the empire, a small number of British, English-speaking Protestant subjects moved into Canada and primarily worked as merchants there. And then there was a small government segment, but they were less than 1% of the population at the time of the Revolution. So you have this distinctly different ethnographic and religious group in the north. They are the biggest colony outside the 13 colonies in North America at the time. And they are connected to the empire primarily through the Atlantic trade. But there is a corridor that had been used primarily for warfare for the past 100 years on the Hudson River, Lake George, Lake Champlain, up into the Richelieu River, where it is in Canada, it leads to the St. Lawrence. And the Canadian population was heavily concentrated along the shores of the St. Lawrence River, that Richelieu River, and the Chaudière River up by Quebec City. It's about 175 miles of populated riverfront from Montreal to Quebec City, with a little bit on either end at the time. And they're pretty remote from the rest of the colonies.
And they're also remote from Nova Scotia and other places that now are part of Canada.
Yes. So Nova Scotia is much closer to Boston than it was to Quebec City by regular surface transport.
Yeah. And there's a distinction between, it was confusing, the old subjects, the new subjects. The old subjects are the British folks who you said had gone there after the war, and the new subjects are the French who had been there.
Yes. So, the old subjects are the new people in Canada, and the new subjects are the people that had traditionally been in Canada. And this fact that they're a completely different group, and particularly that they're Catholic, poses huge problems for the British Empire, because they don't have the legal structure to give the Canadians any real representation in government. They couldn't even be officers in the military or serve in minor posts, because they had to take a test oath that essentially they couldn't do as Catholics. It would make them deny their religion. So particularly with Governor Guy Carleton coming in the mid-1760s, that became the huge challenge that drove Canadian internal politics up to the time of the Revolution.
And one of the things that Carleton is involved in is the formation of the Quebec Act, which tries to resolve all of these problems. And it does so, as you point out, in really an imaginative way. And the Quebec Act on this side of the border looks much different than it does on that side. Can we talk a little bit about the Quebec Act and what it did?
Yeah, Governor Carleton, I think in an honest assessment, really comes up with an enlightened solution to the problem. It accommodates the Catholic Church. It's not fully recognized, I think, in proper terminology, but everything is there to allow the Catholics to keep practicing their faith and to serve in government offices. Both those things are important on the Canadian side of the border because the landholding seigneurs, the nobility of Canada, now have an opportunity and investment in the government of the colony. And the Catholic Church, which had been tolerated up until the Quebec Act, now has its privileges recognized in law. So it's essentially a constitution derived just for Canada. As you mentioned, south of the border, there's a very different take on this. It coincidentally comes at the time of the coercive acts or the intolerable acts. So it gets lumped together with them by the Patriot side. It is seen as recognizing Catholicism, which is anathema to everything that the colonies have stood for since their foundations, with perhaps a minor exception of Maryland. But so it becomes a key fighting point in the summer of 1774 as the distinct features of this become clear. And a big feature of it is it expands the bounds of the province of Quebec. As I talked about at the beginning, it's really the modern province of Quebec up until 1774. And then this act stretches it out through the northern Ohio Valley. So Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, all that is now in the province of Quebec, put under what the other colonies consider a tyrannical government with no representation. Another key feature of the Quebec Act. There is no House of Assembly for Quebec by design.
Yeah, and you make a point that actually there was resistance to that idea. I mean, the old subjects, the English merchants there, want some kind of an assembly, and there's resistance to that from the French-speaking population in Quebec. Yeah,
so we talked about old subjects and new subjects. They are closely tied to what are called the British Party and the French Party. The British Party are those people who came under the auspices of the Proclamation of 1763 that essentially promised English-style government in Canada as part of all the things that the proclamation covered. So they've moved there with the expectations that they will have a House of Assembly. They are given privileged positions because they're the only people that can serve, for example, as justices of the peace, because they can take the test oath. Where the French Party, including government officials, English-speaking government officials, support this to a great degree because they see that they need to incorporate the French, because the next time there is an imperial war, they don't want the French Canadian subjects to immediately align themselves with the French. They would rather have them be part of the empire, and ideally a profitable part of the mercantilist empire as well. So these British and French parties are competing all the way through, particularly once the Quebec Act is announced. And they, once the Quebec Act is approved and prepares to come into force, that's really where the lines are initially drawn inside Canada. I mentioned the seigneurs, the nobility, and the church really like the Quebec Act. It offers a lot to them. What it doesn't offer a lot for is the Canadian farmers, the habitants, who make up most of the population, because now their obligations to the landlords and the church are codified in law, where they had been selectively enforced, perhaps, or voluntarily enforced up until that point. So there's a point of tension there as well.
Right. And you make the point, too, with the Quebec Act that the Declaration uses this as one of the charges against the Crown, that is abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province because it allows French civil law to remain in place while they're going to and not create the assembly. So you have that tension we see on this side of the border. So you have these very interesting communities up there. and the Quebec Act drives this. But then we have what leads then in 1778. You make the point that after Bunker Hill, most of the real fighting in the war happens in Canada as opposed to in what become the 13 colonies. So can we talk a little bit about what leads to the American incursion?
Sure. It's really three phases. The way I look at it is, first off, there's a political phase, starting around the time of the First Continental Congress, where the goal is that war isn't on the, war is looming, but not necessarily going on as the colonies are trying to build their alliance to prove to the ministry in London that they're wrong and the Americans are being denied their rights. So they see that if they can bring Canada in, the 14th colony, that would show even greater unity and common purpose. So at the end of the First Continental Congress, they actually send a letter explicitly to the inhabitants of the province of Quebec, inviting them to the Second Continental Congress to convene in May.
I just want to point out that at this point, the goal of the Congress is really reconciliation of the empire. So they see Quebec as really a bargaining chip, that if we are all united, this will force the ministry to back down. They're not yet thinking about, well, some maybe, about independence or creating the United States.
Yeah, and they get some positive feedback from the British party in Canada because there's common cause there. The real tripping point is the Continental Association, the import-export restrictions that the other 13 colonies, or 12 colonies at the time, had agreed to, is really a tripping point for the Canadians because they're so remote and so reliant on Atlantic trade. It's just economically self-destructive if they were to agree to that. So that's recognized early on as a key point. Where things really start to change is Fort Ticonderoga. There had been some communication before that between Montreal and the Boston Committee, where they hashed out the political stances. But with Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen taking Fort Ticonderoga, that primary transportation route between the colonies, New England and New York, and Canada, is now held on the southern end by the Patriot Americans. They capture the garrison there. So the first military events of the Northern Theater happen there. And Benedict Arnold goes to Canada. Fort St. John's is the border post in Canada. And as part of his commission from Massachusetts, he's to take any ships that he can, and he takes the one armed ship that is there. So now the American side has naval superiority on the lakes. But that starts pushing the conflict into a military aspect. Guy Carleton, the governor of Canada, or Quebec, does not have the military force to really retake that, but he's building, tries to build a ship that he can contest the Americans and perhaps retake the forts. He's also gathering native allies. There's Catholic mission villages across Canada that are out for their own interest, but will give hints or even promises that they will support Carleton militarily. And that's really a confusing part of the situation. In Canada, what this results in is martial law. So between the Quebec Act going into force and martial law, there's a lot of unrest in Canada itself that summer. It's not necessarily tied specifically to the revolution, but it feeds a sentiment in the Northern Army and Continental Congress that the Canadians are really looking for somebody to come help them out, to liberate them from government oppression.
One case where in the church, the vicar is praying for success, leading prayers for success, but then he says some of the parishioners are actually secretly praying that the Bostonians will win. We're talking with Mark Anderson, author of The Battle for the 14th Colony, America's War of Liberation in Canada, 1774-1776. And you also make the point that the Americans do get the sense that the Canadians are going to support them, but support doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take up arms for them. And Carleton has the same problem, that they may say we're supportive of the British regime, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to take up arms for it.
Yes. So getting up to the point of the invasion, there are some Patriot cells in Canada, particularly along the Richelieu River, that indicate that they will support both with supplies and picking up arms if the Americans come to invade. That invitation helps play into the decision to invade on June 27th, 1775, shortly after the Army is created, the Continental Army. Congress authorizes General Philip Schuyler, the commander, to invade Canada if it won't be offensive to the Canadians. So this is an important part of Schuyler's decision, which has been delegated to him, is that he needs to gauge Canadian sentiment, and he's getting indications from those kind of people in Canada that there is some favor towards that idea. And then at the end of August 1775, there's two things that really drive the final decision to invade. George Washington has decided to send Benedict Arnold through the Maine wilderness to try to surprise Quebec City. And he wants to make sure that Schuyler's actually going to launch the invasion before he sends Arnold off on his trip. And intelligence comes in from Canada that the warship that Guy Carleton is building at Fort St. John's is imminently ready to be launched. So it's better to get it before it can be launched with an attack than it is to wait for it to set sail. So General Schuyler's deputy, General Richard Montgomery, leads the first invasion force, and they arrive in Canada on the 5th of September, 1775. And initially, they're not met with a lot of warm embrace from the Canadians, because the Canadians aren't really sure if they're going to stay there. It takes a while before they get confidence that the Americans are really committed to this invasion before they start showing up. And then the same people that had made the promises during the summer start to show up with support.
But then Ethan Allen kind of takes that. He does lead a force into Montreal prematurely and winds up the folks in Montreal don't rise in support.
Yes. So as the invasion spins on the first 3 weeks of September, they start to get Canadian support. Canadians are actually taking up arms and serving in what become siege lines around Fort St. John's. They are Canadians are stopping British troops and supplies from getting to the forts from Montreal. So the south bank of the St. Lawrence River is really controlled by the American invaders with their Canadian Patriot allies. And the British are on the island of Montreal, north shore of the St. Lawrence, where there's some army force, but not a lot. And then, as you mentioned, September 25th, Ethan Allen, with apparently some miscommunication, thinks that he's going in on a three-pronged attack to take Montreal. He arrives on the morning of September 25th to find that the other two prongs have not launched. Apparently miscommunication as far as timing goes, but he decides he's going to try to threaten Montreal anyways. He's gotten a lot of reports from inside the walls that all he has to do is show up and they will open the gates for him. But that's not what happens. Governor Carleton is there. He gathers the troops that he has and the loyalist, particularly the upper class militia officers, to gather enough force that goes out to defeat Ethan Allen, and he becomes a prisoner at that point. And that's a real setback for the American invasion, which had been seeming to go quite well up to that point. And it brings about a month of stalemate and inactivity until the Americans, and with great Canadian help, 300 Canadians, contribute to the take of Fort Chambly, which is the only other post south of the St. Lawrence. And that kind of switches gears to the point where Fort St. John's is taken, surrenders on 4th, 5th of November of that year. So a couple months of fighting around Fort St. John's, and then things open up.
And then Carleton actually has to slip out of Montreal. I think it's more important than to rally folks in Quebec.
Yeah, he sees Montreal, it has walls, but it's not really defendable against anything but Indian attacks. So he decides that his best hope for keeping the province for the crown is to evacuate downriver to Quebec City. So that's a northeast trip to Quebec City, which is a big fortified stronghold. And he doesn't have a lot of troops there because many of them had captured at Fort St. John's, where his goal was to have, block the invaders at the border. When that didn't work, he took the few that he had with him as he went to Quebec City, but the ships have a hard time getting past American forces there and end up surrendering. So when he gets to Quebec City, he's really reliant on the militia and ragtag batches of different regular and provincial troops that he has available. But he helps solidify what had been a shaky garrison in Quebec City, and then prepares for the coming Americans that have already actually arrived by the time he gets there. Benedict Arnold has made his trip through the Maine wilderness up the Chaudière River, but arrives just a little too late. Quebec City has decided that they are going to resist. They do not surrender when he parades in front of the walls. And so he has to withdraw and wait for reinforcements before they can take on Quebec City.
I think each side probably knew this, the Montcalm and Wolfe's encounter at Quebec 15 years earlier, when Montcalm could have stayed in the city perhaps and held it, as opposed to coming out and giving battle. So this may be, many of these guys on each side had fought in that early campaign.
There's definitely recent history affecting both of them.
We're talking with Mark Anderson, author of The Battle for the 14th Colony, America's War of Liberation in Canada. And then while Carleton has gone off to Quebec to solidify things there, merchants in Montreal are kind of secretly letting Montgomery know that we'll surrender the city to you. So he does wind up taking Montreal.
Yeah, when Montgomery arrives at the gates, there's some negotiations going on, perhaps a day of negotiations. The Canadians offer to surrender the city, and Montgomery says, you can't surrender. You don't have any force to resist. Let's just agree to some terms. So effectively agrees to respect their rights and not impose on them a whole lot if they'll just open the gates. And so that's what happens. And Montreal becomes an occupied city for the next 7 or 8 months.
And so who is in charge then? Is there a civil government put in place? That is one of the problems that you identified.
That is a big part of the problem. General Schuyler, leading the invasion, and has to leave because he is very sick. So after a few days of the invasion of Canada, he goes back to Fort Ticonderoga to try to recover his health. General Montgomery's left in charge. Both of them are riding back to the Continental Congress from the time they set foot in Canada. We need political help. We can lead the military campaign, but somebody's got to help make these political decisions and help the Canadians get on their feet to start forming committees and a Congress of their own that they can then send the delegates that we've wanted from Canada. That committee does not come anytime soon. So they're left leaving it in the hands of Canadian patriots and military authorities. And the Canadian patriot that primarily takes the lead, Thomas Walker, is a pretty unpopular guy just by his character. Benjamin Franklin says something about he could make enemies out of anybody based on just his personality.
And Thomas Walker and his, can we talk? Who are Thomas Walker and Martha Walker? They're a couple in Montreal. Are they English? Are they American? Where are they from?
They're from England, but had spent some time in Boston before moving to Canada in 1764.
Mm-hmm.
Walker really liked his position there because, as we talked about earlier, only Protestant subjects can hold office. He was a justice of the peace, and he actively enforced or fought for British rights, which included not quartering British troops in civilian houses. And this leads to a showdown where masked marauders show up at his house in the middle of the night, rough him up, chop off part of his ear. And so he is hostile to the British authorities and the British Army from that point on top of his personality. So he is eager to talk to the Americans. He is eager to cooperate with them. And he's got some good, substantial wealth to back up his contested political power. So he helps underwrite part of the invasion, along with James Price, who is another imported old subject merchant. They're really the key players on the British Canadian side when the Americans come in.
And then John Brown is a character from Western Massachusetts who's also got involved in a lot of this pre-invasion.
Yeah, John Brown is really the mover and shaker on the American side of the border. He is the one who goes to Canada in March before Lexington conquered and talks to the Montreal Committee, gauges their political support. On his way back, he assesses how things are at Fort Ticonderoga, and then he is there when Fort Ticonderoga is taken. In the summer of 1775, he is making trips into Canada to gather intelligence and communicate with the Canadian patriots there. And then he leads a force with the invasion force, and he is really the mastermind for cooperation with the Canadian patriots, maintaining that control over the south, everything south of the St. Lawrence, up until the point where Montgomery takes Fort St. John's. So he is a key player, and really so much hinges on his activities.
Yeah. Another character, Moses Hazen, is originally from Massachusetts, and you have an episode after Arnold's raid on St. John's. He has a cordial conversation, Hazen and Arnold, and then Arnold goes off to alert Carleton that there's this invading force.
Yeah, Hazen is really an interesting character. As you mentioned, he's from New England, served as a ranger officer in the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, and then settled in Canada as a half-pay officer, married a French-Canadian wife, and he lives right across from Fort St. John's. So he feels obligations initially as a half-pay officer to, as you say, run that message to Governor Carleton that there has been this incursion into Canada back in May. And then he doesn't do a whole lot until the invading force shows up.
Yep.
And then he waffles for the first few days of the invasion. He shows up to talk to General Schuyler in private. And there's no actual proof that he's the one who talked, but all the indicators are there that he's the one who came to talk to General Schuyler and said, maybe you don't want to invade Canada. Perhaps just do your thing and leave. But the invasion presses on, and he gets caught communicating with both sides. He gets captured by John Brown, who is then attacked by the garrison of Fort St. John's. Moses Hazen is then taken prisoner by the Fort St. John's garrison, the British side.
So he's captured by both sides.
Right. But he takes a committed turn after he is released, freed by the Americans from his imprisonment. And he decides to go to the Congress in Philadelphia and comes back with a commission to form a Canadian regiment, a Continental Canadian regiment. So he's decisively taken sides at that point in early 1776.
Wow. I mean, and this is after Montgomery and Arnold attacked Quebec in on December 31st. I mean, they're both looking at the fact that their troops their enlistments are going to be up and they need to do something. And so they choose to attack Quebec. It would have been a great thing if it had worked. Do you think there was a possibility that they could have taken Quebec?
Tactically, it was a big challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Montgomery was facing a lot of obstacles. The Canadians, for the most part, were not willing to throw themselves behind the American side until Quebec City had fallen and the Americans had demonstrated a real commitment and staying power. They had been through the French and Indian War, Wolfe's campaigns, and seen how destructive it could be if they picked the losing side.
Right.
There were, however, hundreds of Canadians that did take up arms and served on the siege lines, blockade of Quebec City, and provided important support up to the attack on Quebec City and after that. General Montgomery, with no real authorization, had already formed one Canadian Continental Regiment, and that went with him to Quebec City. And then Montgomery is saying that he needs Canadian support. He's not going to get a Canadian government formed until Quebec City has fallen. And a big chunk of his troops enlistments end on New Year's Day, 1776. Right. So he sees a last shot to try to take Quebec City and meet his campaign objectives. Not great odds, but he says fortune favors the brave. So he's going to try it. But unfortunately, the first shots take out General Montgomery, and it all goes downhill from there.
It does. It does. We're talking with Mark Anderson, author of The Battle for the 14th Colony, America's War of Liberation in Canada, 1774-1776. Now, it seems like reading your book, you have these different players, and one wonders if there was an American strategy or if it simply was Montgomery having to make decisions, Arnold having to make decisions, and folks like Walker and Hazen all sometimes operating in tandem, but also sometimes operating just because they're there and they need to do something.
So as far as a military strategy goes, there was a basic one for the campaign. It was send Arnold and Montgomery from two different ends of the province, and Carleton's going to have to commit one way or the other. The timing didn't really work out that great to force Carleton to make a decision, but that was the military plan. Where the strategy was lacking was, in modern terms, we talk about diplomatic, information, military, and economic means of strategy, and it was the information part was there. There were messages to the Canadians. How effective those were is debatable. There was a military strategy, but the diplomatic and economic sides were lacking. They already knew that Canada relied on the Atlantic trade. There was no plan to help try to get them by. And diplomatically, we already talked about the committee to help them set up a political structure, communicate how they were expected to fit into the Confederation of the colonies, just was completely lacking. So even if they had military success in the initial campaign, it was going to be a hard thing to maintain without a actual Canadian government to even fight in exile. And without Canadian military support, it was going to be a real hard challenge to fight off the British relief force that everybody knew was coming in the spring of May 1776.
You make the point, too, that Montgomery asks for some kind of a political Congress to send a committee, and the first one they send doesn't get past Fort Ticonderoga, and they talk to Schuyler. They never talk with Montgomery. And then the next one arrives, 4 months after Montgomery's dead in April of 1776 with Charles Carroll, the Carroll brothers. They send a Catholic priest along with Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Samuel Chase, and of course Benjamin Franklin, and they arrive in Montreal just as all of this is falling apart. And it's a fascinating thing to think about this commission in Montreal, and long after it seems they could have done something because now the whole campaign is falling apart.
Yeah, by the time they arrive, due to lots of political developments that are happening in Philadelphia in early 1776, and a lack of agreement on what the actual commission for this committee is going to be, because the Declaration of Independence hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
There's some hesitation in Congress to give them too much authority, but they end up going with effectively dictatorial authority over both military and political affairs. But as you mentioned, they're way too late to make a difference. They only come and stir things up. The good things that had managed to happen get knocked down, and the things that they try to implement that might be positive don't have time to take any effect. And military authority gets undermined in important ways. They make decisions without consulting with the military authorities to understand why military authorities had made certain decisions. General David Wooster, a Connecticut colonial wars veteran, had been left in charge in Montreal up through the end of March 1776, when he went to take charge at Quebec City, because he was the senior officer in Canada. But the Continental Commission, the politicians, took an immediate disliking to him and everything that he had done, undermined everything that he had done, good or bad. And there was distinct hostility between them even before they finally met up.
You are more sympathetic to Worcester than most other historians have been. I mean, even people at the time were.
Yeah, I think Worcester became a punching bag for failure of the campaign. He did the best with what he had to work with, in my assessment.
Yeah.
Some of the accusations against him for being anti-Catholic, I don't think really stand up historical scrutiny, but they have carried down in the historiography. And particularly as they're trying to hold on in May 1776, anticipating a British relief fleet is going to show up at any minute, he is doing a really tough job trying to keep troops there until super slow reinforcements can arrive from the colonies. They've been on their way, promised for months. The long supply chain, they just can't get there. And so he's losing men one for one instead of having a negative force strength due to his significant efforts there. But is he a great strategic thinker? Probably not, but I think he does a lot more than people give him credit for.
Yeah. And of course, they're also suffering from smallpox at this point. And Congress had Charles Lee seemed like the guy to send, because he's the only Continental officer who speaks French, and he's ready to go. But then they want him to go to South Carolina instead to defend Charleston. I'm wondering, too, because you have Montgomery, who seems like a very capable guy, who's he's killed, and Arnold is badly wounded. And there are other officers like John Thomas who's going to die. I wonder if you see any of this impacting then the early war, losing these really key officers early on, and how this is going to affect the rest of the war.
Part of the failure in Canada is lack of continuity of leadership. You talk about Schuyler leaves sick, Montgomery dies, John Thomas arrives to take charge, only to die of smallpox within a matter of weeks. And Worcester is in and out of command at those times, and hostile to the committee. So it's a recipe for disaster there. Benedict Arnold is the other one who comes in and out of leadership, generally more positive than not. But I think, to answer your question, the failure to have any sustained leadership in Canada does affect the grand way the war plays out in subsequent years, because the leaders in Canada don't really bring a lot to the table. They're not incorporated into Washington's army, except Arnold, at the general officer level, because they're dead. Or Schuyler remains north. So I think at the junior officer and field grade officer level, there's some lessons learned that carry back and forth. At the general officer level, Arnold is the only one who's bringing it back and forth. And Congress doesn't really do a good job of assessing why the campaign failed. You mentioned smallpox. They identified two other causes for the failure of the campaign: short enlistments, which had driven Montgomery's attack on Quebec City, and a lack of hard money, because the Canadians were not willing to accept paper money. So that affected their ability to keep supplied in Canada. Those were all politically palatable excuses for
Right.
why this campaign failure, but there were a lot bigger reasons, many of which lay in Congress in Philadelphia for why the campaign failed.
And Congress isn't going to look at itself and say, we really were part of botching this.
Especially since at the time this committee is meeting in Congress, they're also drafting a Declaration of Independence
Right.
and have made the declaration by the time that they make this agreement resolution
Right.
that there's these three causes.
Right. There's much more to the book. I don't want to give it all away. We could spend the rest of the day talking about it because it's such a fascinating story, and you have a lot of really great pieces of it. I like that the day the Quebec Act goes into effect, someone defaces George III's statue in front of the cathedral in Montreal and hanging a cross around its neck with a sign that says what is it? The Fool of England, the Pope of England, the Fool of Canada, or something like that.
Yeah, I don't remember which variation on that is, but yeah, it captures those thoughts.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, Mark, since you are a career officer in the Air Force and you were involved in a lot of the effort in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you can kind of see some of this interpretation. I mean, parallels or similarities to what went wrong in Canada. I wonder if you can think if this is coloring the way you interpret it or if it's just there. I mean, this is the story.
So the roots of this book are actually based on my military experience. I was, as part of my duties, one of my assignments was to work at Central Command as they were really looking to import democracy to both Iraq and Afghanistan. And it sparked this memory of this class that I'd had in my master's program about the Revolutionary War invasion of Canada. I'm like, I see some parallels here of a very different ethnic group, very different religion, and this outside force coming in with expectations based with some intelligence, perhaps, that they would be welcomed to try to bring a new form of government, much more American form of government. So I initially started off with what might have been an article project to try to look at some comparisons that might be there. And as I went along, I was really unhappy with what was available on the invasion of Canada as a comprehensive look at it, and that resulted in the book. As far as explicit comparisons, I don't, after I'd done the book, I don't know that there are a whole lot of crossovers. There was a lot more in common between the Canadians and the 13 colonies than I think there is with Muslim Asian countries. A lot bigger obstacles to conquer in the 21st century than they faced in Canada. Not that there weren't big obstacles as we see.
But certainly there are always lessons that we can learn about episodes like this. I mean, you've done a really masterful job with this book, telling this story and really showing how interesting and how important it was.
Yeah, I think if there were to be two lessons that might apply to Canada to future things would be careful who you're listening to, because the Continental Army and Continental Congress were hearing from people that were the most favorable to them. And there needs to be a full spectrum strategy from the get-go. Military force is not going to liberate a people. It can occupy a people, but there has to be political support from the population if there's going to be success in a war of liberation like this.
Well, thank you very much. We've been talking with Mark Anderson, whose book is The Battle for the 14th Colony, America's War of Liberation in Canada, 1774-1776. Thank you so much for joining us, Mark.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so thanks again to Jonathan Lane, our producer, the man behind the curtain, as well as our listeners. Every week we thank folks in different parts of the country, the world, who are tuning in regularly. And if you are in one of these places and want some of our Revolution 250 swag, send Jonathan Lane an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And if you're not in one of these places and want to contact Jonathan, so send him an email. and Jay Lane at revolution250.org. And this week, I want to thank our listeners in Alexandria, Virginia, Memphis, Tennessee, and Amman, Tel Aviv, Johannesburg, South Africa, Hamburg, New York, here in Massachusetts, in Lexington and Worcester, and in the Christiansburg, Virginia, and in the borough of Brent in the United Kingdom. Thank you all, and all places between and beyond. And now we'll be piped out on the road to Boston.